Andy Greenberg, really looking forward to this conversation since your release of Traces in the Dark. You're a world renowned writer on all things hackers, cybersecurity, surveillance, and information freedom. So I'm sure this is going to be an incredibly insightful dark mode episode. Thanks so much for joining us, Andy.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you both.
Appreciate you tuning in from the US. I've got to get straight into Traces in the Dark. Like your coverage on some of the most prolific and even tragic dark web users of cyber gangs is quite unparalleled in the stories that you do unwind in Traces in the Dark. I've just finished reading that book myself. What was that experience like for you interviewing some of the key actors, the agents, the technology founders, and even the cyber criminals themselves during that whole process of the book?
Yeah, well, I think you listed them almost exactly in the opposite order of how I approach them. I first kind of got into this world from by talking to more of the criminal side of the dark web. And in 2013, I interviewed the Dread Pirate Roberts, who was like the creator of the Silk Road, and that came out of my fascination with what seemed to me to be like possibly a real untouchable private space on the internet that had been carved out so that law enforcement and government couldn't reach in. And I, maybe a little more than I should have, believed in some of the promises people were making about the anonymity potential of not just the dark web, but of specifically of cryptocurrency, which was described to me. And I believed that it was a potentially kind of untraceable, anonymous digital cash for the internet, like that you could put these unmarked bills in a briefcase and send them across the internet to anyone in the world without revealing your identity. And I was being an impressionable young man back then. I don't know. I guess back then I was fascinated and a little bit thrilled by the very subversive and even criminal potential that seemed to hold. And so I sought out, when the Silk Road appeared, I sought out the Dread Pirate Roberts and interviewed him for Forbes magazine back then. And he did tell me all of these promises about how this was just the beginning of a kind of revolution that would be ushered in by Bitcoin. But then, like, flash forward to around 2020, I began, I guess throughout those years, I'd seen the research papers, I'd seen like the advancements in cryptocurrency tracing that were happening. And this notion that cryptocurrency was truly private or anonymous had been slowly chipped away in my mind. But it was only in 2020 that I began to see like one U.S. Justice Department's announcement after another of a massive takedown. And they were all crediting this company Chainalysis and thanking them for their assistance. And Chainalysis was, this still kind of, to me, mysterious cryptocurrency tracing firm. And that's when I sought out Chainalysis and started talking first to one of its founders, Jonathan Levin. That's kind of when I realized just how not just like a little bit wrong I had been, but like how opposite from right I had been about Bitcoin. Like it was the opposite of untraceable. It had actually become, in the hands of someone like of analysts, Chainalysis, fully traceable practically. And that it had served as a kind of trap that had persisted for years for people seeking financial privacy and all sorts of cyber criminals. And it was through Chainalysis that I started to figure out who some of the major federal agents and agencies and prosecutors in these big cases had been. And in some cases, Chainalysis even introduced me to them, but in others, I went to just kind of sought them out myself. And I think the way that this often works is that when people get a sense that you are getting a piece of the story, they want to give you their part of it, or they're more incentivized to because they don't want to be left out, understandably from kind of incredible investigative achievements that they did pull off. So after talking to Chainalysis, I first kind of got in with IRS criminal investigations, who I have very little experience reporting from law enforcement's perspective, but this was a different kind of law enforcement agency. I don't think most people even know, even in the United States, of course, that the Internal Revenue Service that collects our taxes also has within it a law enforcement agency that are these forensic accountants who also carry guns and make arrests and act like a little FBI, or I suppose like AFP, in your part of the world, like that they are full blown, follow the money federal agents with all those law enforcement powers. So I started talking to them, and then I realized that very quickly that this one guy, Tigran Gambarian, this one IRS criminal investigator, had been at the center of so many of these cases, and he became the protagonist of the story. But once I had IRS CI really talking to me, other agencies, I think, wanted to tell their parts of the story too, or other agents at least, and prosecutors, and one led to the next. And then before I knew it, I was writing a book that, was really unlike anything I've ever written before, that is told from the, really very often untold perspective of these detectives.
It's such a dark and mysterious and an elusive area of the digital realm. It surprises me that these people want to come and tell their story so publicly. Did you get that vibe that it's more about presenting themselves, presenting what they've done, and it's all towards ego, it's ego driven? Or do you think there's actually a movement occurring in the darker places?
Well, I think that, you could call it ego, but then like some of these agents wouldn't even give me their real names and didn't want to be named in the book, but did tell me parts of the story. I think in part just because it's like if you've been involved in a really crazy caper where you found out like a new way to identify a dark web drug lord through cryptocurrency tracing for the first time in history, it's very difficult just to sit on that, to keep that in your pocket for your whole life, like to take it to your grave. I think that part of it is just like sometimes the story is so good that it's hard not to tell it for law enforcement. But yeah, I think sometimes like they wanted to get credit too. And then in many cases, I found that like agents and prosecutors and Chainalysis would tell me part of the story and then keep like certain secret sources and methods to themselves. But by talking to enough of the people involved, you can sometimes triangulate those things. The things they leave out aren't always in sync. Sometimes they don't, their stories aren't fully they haven't got the story straight. So they end up telling you different parts of the story and you can piece it all together, perhaps even more than the law enforcement agencies involved sometimes wanted me to. There were a couple cases where I wrestled with like, should I expose a secret technique or like an investigative technique that has not ever been discussed before and may still be being used to go after dark web criminals. It was a new experience for me to be in that position. And I don't know, it's sometimes, despite the fact that so many law enforcement agencies and prosecutors participated in this, I still feel like I had to make my own decisions about what to tell and what not to.
Yeah, I was going to ask Andy, it seems like you were put in a pretty unique scenario where you did have access to this sort of information, these new techniques, and you're now sharing this pretty publicly through Traces in the Dark. So I'm sure that would have been fraught with its own decision making and sitting in that unique part of this entire ecosystem of criminal actors, what's happening in cyber and law enforcement, everything in between, even some of the methods used, across even the geopolitical spectrum. There's been a lot of talk even about the cyber war coming out of the kinetic action in Ukraine and Russia. These sort of things are really topical at the moment. So yeah, being really at the center of that must have been an incredibly interesting experience.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe talking even more about my last book, previous to Treasures in the Dark, which was Sandworm, where I tried to capture this very recent history of the biggest, like, full blown cyber war, I would say, to have ever taken place, which was happening in Ukraine starting in 2014 through around the time that book came out in 2019, but has since taken a new shape in the last year in the midst of Russia's full blown physical invasion of Ukraine and all of the tragedy that's accompanied it.
Seems to be such a and I love Sandberg. I loved Sandworm. I thought that was a great story to tell, and I think it's a really important story to tell. Whilst we're on the Ukraine and Russia war, there seems to be, in your book, you predicted this massive cyber war that people talk about, and the precursor talk before this recording, we talked about how we didn't quite predict it. I don't think you did either, but there seems to be this precursor cyber war conversation versus a kinetic action war. And we're seeing in the Ukraine Russia conflict the human cost of that kinetic war and the war crimes that are occurring. Do you think that the precursor cyber war is continuing, and do you think that will be a major player in future kinetic warfare?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think people have gotten so used to the idea that cyber war books are about prediction because for so long, cyber war was this thing like looming in the future. I think it still is in a way, but like I tried with Sandworm to really tell a story about events that had happened. I mean, that's like, I know that sounds silly, but like so many cyber war books have not been that for so long. They've been predictive or almost like science fiction. And this, in Sandworm, I was telling stories about how this one group of hackers, this one group of Russian military intelligence agency hackers, Sandworm, really did turn off the lights, cause blackouts, not once, but twice in Ukraine, and like destroyed networks inside of Ukrainian media and government agencies and finance, and targeted their election in 2014, 2 years before they would meddle in the US election, and tried to fake the results of the presidential election in 2014, all leading up to Sandworm releasing this piece of malware called NotPetya that was essentially a self-replicating wiper or pretending to be ransomware, but just destroying any data it touched that spreads, it essentially like carpet bombed the entire Ukrainian internet, took out every government agency, practically every bank, multiple hospitals, multiple airports, shut down the ability to use public transit in some cases or to use credit cards and ATMs, and spread to the rest of the world and took out the world's largest shipping company and FedEx and Merck's pharmaceutical manufacturing. I mean, those are the things that people used to write predictive stories about. And then they happened in 2017 mostly. And that was the story I was telling. It was not a predictive book, but I did want to warn about the fact that if we didn't respond, if in the US in particular, or what I would say the Five Eyes, and Australia was absolutely part of this too, didn't try to draw red lines for what, norms about like how states should behave and to punish countries like Russia that had crossed those red lines to attack civilian critical infrastructure, then things would get worse. And so in that sense, it's about the future. But then I think a lot of people, I think as you're getting at, have said, well, where's the cyber war in Ukraine that's accompanying this invasion? And I would say that it's happening before our eyes. It's just been somewhat obscured, I think rightfully, by the physical war and the incredible toll that it's taken on civilians and the death and destruction of actual bombs and bullets and and munitions hitting Ukrainian civilians. But in the midst of that, we have seen, in fact, a new tempo of cyber attacks from, in many cases, the same hackers, including Sandworm, the GRU, the Russian military intelligence agency, hitting civilian targets, launching these data destroying attacks. I think I saw news today that Sandworm had released a new wiper against Ukrainian targets. In fact, the tempo of those attacks has only increased. They've kind of gotten less sophisticated, less like kind of complicated, ambitious. There's no new NotPetya, no new like masterpiece of destructive code. They're simple, basic, destructive, targeted attacks that are just being released in this relentless way, or rather thrown at organizations just on a almost daily basis. So all of that is happening under the surface of, I mean, rightfully so, I would say again, of the physical war that that has led to many thousands of deaths and an enormous refugee crisis, and kind of drowned out the cyber war that if it were happening anywhere else would probably still be one of the biggest cyber wars in history.
Really unfortunate events for sure. There was a couple of guests we had recently on Dark Mode, Andy, speaking really about the conflict there, and even some of the Australian capability looking to support Ukraine and the Ministry of Digital Transformation and bolster some of the cybersecurity capabilities, yet alone the military support, political support, and the like coming out of the region. So yeah, really tragic events, and just think what a timeline to be living in as well, to be seeing all of this occurring globally. It's just unfathomable in a sense. Andy, I wanted to actually just take you back to some of the recent stuff out of Traces in the Dark, if I could. For those listening outside of the cyber industry, of which we do have a few global audience and listeners tuning in, being very fascinated by cyber and criminal gangs and all things technology advancements as well. Would you be able to just explain Silk Road, AlphaBay, the welcome to video? I'm interested in speaking about that. Really, really tragic atrocities happening across society. This sort of stuff happening on the dark web and as it relates to operating in cyberspace can be really dark. Could you talk us through what they are, the evolution, and what you experienced when you were authoring Traces in the Dark?
Yeah, I don't know where to start. That's like the whole book.
Yeah.
But I'll
Yeah.
start with this with the Silk Road, which is what I was discussing earlier with the Dread Pirate Roberts. So
Yeah.
the Silk Road was the first dark web black market for drugs, primarily. And it was very ideologically driven. The Dread Pirate Roberts saw himself as this revolutionary, ultra libertarian, crypto anarchist almost, and wanted to foil the state with a capital S and allow people to buy and sell and put in their bodies whatever they wanted. The Silk Road was ultimately taken down not through cryptocurrency tracing, but through, I don't know, more like old fashioned, if you can say that, digital detective work and a few slip ups that Ross Ulbricht, the young man who turned out to be the Dread Pirate Roberts, made. He was arrested in the San Francisco Public Library where he was working with his laptop open, logged into the Silk Road. And he had, sort of getting some of these stories, it's hard not to just get into the details, but he had full disk encryption on his laptop and thought that if he could, he would be able to just close the lid of it if the feds were coming for him. And that would lock his secrets forever and make them impenetrable thanks to that encryption. An undercover agent was able to snatch his laptop off the desk right in front of him, open and unencrypted. So he's now serving a life sentence without parole in the United States. But then in the wake of the Silk Road case, which was nothing to do with cryptocurrency tracing. In fact, at that time, cryptocurrency and Bitcoin were still considered essentially anonymous and untraceable. Like it seemed, in fact, the Silk Road had stayed online for 2.5 years using Bitcoin to do hundreds of millions of dollars in black market transactions. So it seemed to be almost like proven that Bitcoin was working in this way to foil investigators. But this one guy, Tigran Gambaryan, in the wake of the Silk Road bust, and he had read an important paper about Bitcoin tracing that came out around that time. And he was like, I think that I can follow this money. He was an IRS criminal investigator, as I said. So that was his job. And he actually followed essentially some missing funds from the Silk Road investigation and found 2 dirty cops, essentially a DEA agent and a Secret Service agent who had both enriched themselves as corruptly as part of the Silk Road investigation. One had potentially sold information as a double agent to the Dread Pirate Roberts. Another had, stolen funds from the Silk Road. And through cryptocurrency tracing, Tigran Gambaryan proved their guilt and they went to prison. And that was in some ways a relatively small case because it was just a few $100,000 for each of these 2 corrupt agents. But it was a kind of proof of concept that actually everything we knew about cryptocurrency was wrong. You could trace this, you could follow the money to prove people's guilt. And then Tigran Gambaryan actually ends up meeting one of the founders of Chainalysis, a Danish man named Michael Groninger, who actually was, I would say, the original founder, although Jonathan Levin and others came in shortly after. And they became this sort of odd couple who would then, the IRS criminal investigations and Chainalysis together became this incredible odd partnership that would go on to bust one massive cyber criminal operation after another throughout the rest of the story of the book. But the next one I think that you want to talk about is AlphaBay, which is this like dark web crime market that's after a kind of series of, after that power vacuum was filled following the Silk Road takedown by one black market after another that would come online and be busted through their mistakes or exit scam. Like sometimes the creator of the market, the black market, would just run off with everybody's money. Finally, AlphaBay kind of took this top spot on the dark web and then just stayed there and grew until eventually it was 10 times the size of the Silk Road. And by late 2016, 2017, it seemed like this enormous problem for law enforcement that now there was a more professional kind of Silk Road sequel, vastly larger in size, still growing enormously, and a lot of agencies and prosecutors were worried that they would never be able to take it down, that this was a true criminal mastermind who would stay a step ahead of them forever. And they even believed at that time that this kind of mysterious kingpin of AlphaBay, who called himself Alpha02, was based in Russia, perhaps. He signed off his messages in Russian. And that might mean that he was beyond their reach and untouchable. And they could not take down this new, much larger dark web black market. Ultimately, it turns out that Alpha02 had made some of his own mistakes. And early on, in the earliest days of AlphaBay's time online, its user forums, when you register for them, actually leaked his email address, pimp_Alex_91 at hotmail.com. That turned out to be the email address of Alexander Kaz, this French-Canadian man living in Bangkok, who would turn out to be the biggest dark web drug lord in the world. And that was the first time the law enforcement, this was like, it took them until late 2016 to learn that, to get that tip. An anonymous source held on to that email with its metadata for 2 years before handing it over. But even then, it almost seemed like too easy, like too good to be true. And the agents and prosecutors looking at this weren't sure that they had the right guy. They thought perhaps that Alexander Kaz was being framed or set up by the real Alpha02. And it was only through cryptocurrency tracing that they were able to, for the first time ever, prove the identity of a dark web drug lord through following the money, through tracing his cryptocurrency profits. So simultaneously, that anonymous tip about Alexander Kaz's email actually came into the Fresno office of the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration in California, the US. But then simultaneously, these two FBI analysts on the other side of the country in Washington, DC, just independently had this idea of how to trace Alexander Kaz's, or they didn't know his name, trace Alpha02's cryptocurrency profits. And using like a quite clever technique, they were able to essentially find several sums of his profits on the blockchain within this cluster of addresses that Chainalysis had determined to be AlphaBays, and to follow that money out to a whole series of cryptocurrency exchanges.
I think the interesting part, and I was really impressed by the story about Chainalysis, and interestingly, a local friend of mine has subsequently gone on to work for Chainalysis here locally in Australia. I heard about the technology probably 2 years ago now, and I was like, that's incredible. And having read Traces in the Dark, it was cool to see how that technology was employed. But certainly, Andy, if you could bring to life what the actual methodologies are and how that works, I think would be super interesting.
Yeah. Well, Chainalysis had done the first big job of figuring out which addresses within I think by that point, hundreds of millions on the Bitcoin blockchain belonged to AlphaBay. That was very difficult and involved some really clever fingerprinting techniques, basically. But then, so Chainalysis then for its customers, which included the FBI, was able to label this like cluster, as they called it, of 2.5 million addresses within the blockchain that represented this massive constellation of AlphaBays, all of its money, essentially. It's buyers and sellers and administrators' money. And then these two FBI agents who called themselves, they asked me to just call them Ali and Aaron. They said like some people didn't want their names really published, even when they did very interesting things. Ali and Aaron had this notion that, what about exit scams? When an exit scam happens, as I described, when an administrator steals everybody's money from a dark web market, all the other dark web markets get spooked and everybody warns each other, don't keep your money on a dark web market unless you're about to spend it. And so all this money pulls out of all the other markets. And the only person who would not have to pull out their money or ever worry about an exit scam would be another administrator. That is somebody who never has to worry about having their funds stolen by the boss of the site because they are the boss. So Ali and Aaron had this idea to comb through all those addresses and look at ones that held large sums and that had not moved even in the midst of major exit scams. And within the AlphaBay cluster, they found one very promising subset of those addresses that had sat still through multiple exit scams, not at all scared somehow, and then eventually had been cashed out to a cryptocurrency exchange. They traced that money. They sent a subpoena to the exchange. They actually sent the subpoena before the tip came to them about Alexander Kaz's name. And then just days after that tip came to the FBI in Washington, D.C. through the grapevine, all the way from Fresno, essentially, the result of the subpoena came back, and lo and behold, it was Alexander Kaz's account on that exchange. They had basically independently, although it ultimately confirmed that Alexander Kaz was this dark web kingpin, and sort of nailed to the wall this theory that had otherwise just, hung from a couple of threads. That's really when this giant law enforcement team that would come to be known as Operation Bayonet was off to the races, trying to find him in Bangkok and somehow take him down. And the challenge at that point was that he had learned from Ross Ulbricht. As I said, like, Ross Ulbricht had an open laptop in the San Francisco library. Alexander Kaz not only used full disk encryption on the laptop that he used to administer AlphaBay, but never opened that laptop outside of his own home, which was behind a gate and a wall in the outskirts of Bangkok. So getting to that laptop in an open state required like this elaborate sting with like 9 undercover agents all positioned around his block, and car crashing into his front gate and all this stuff. Maybe I should leave it for the book, because it's
Well,
like
it's a
maybe
very
more
interesting tip.
action
Yeah, absolutely.
than
I
I
mean,
can
the
tell
way,
here.
yeah, you're giving us all a sneak peek, Andy, for those who haven't read Traces in the Dark, as to what that elaborate operation looked like. I mean, it was fully staged. They had complete different actors, like you said, car crashing, trying to get Alexander to actually come out of the house, and it was this whole stage thing. So he certainly learnt the lesson from the successor almost. Yeah. Very, very
Yeah, he
interesting.
did. He did. And nonetheless, I mean, he was still, to spoil the ending a little bit, taken down, and AlphaBay was torn offline. Another part of this, I should say, like, another part of this story is that Tigran Gambarian, my IRS protagonist, and Chainalysis worked together to develop a secret technique that identified the AlphaBay server at the same time, found the IP address of the server through its use of cryptocurrency, which shouldn't be possible, but was. And when I heard that, I was like, what? How is that? How could you do that? And that became this other kind of rabbit hole that I went down to. And that was a technique that they really did not want me to burn, to expose in the book, and one that I really wrestled with. I will leave like the details of what that secret technique was for the book, I think, because it's a bit technical. But I was lucky that just as I finished the reporting of the book, really, a Chainalysis document, a presentation that they had made to the Italian police, leaked onto the dark web. And it included on one of its pages a description of this secret technique. So it was taken out of my hands. And luckily, I wasn't the first to expose it, but I was able to give readers the answer to that mystery of like how this secret Chainalysis and IRS technique works.
Yeah, the once thought to be untraceable cryptocurrency. Just like a fine tooth comb going through some of those investigative methods.
It's based on blockchain, right? And the second part to blockchain is chain. Chains are made of links. Links lead to X, right? For me, it's always been that case. And there's the misconception between anonymity and untraceability. I think we've merged those two together just to think that it's completely mysterious and we're completely untraceable and anonymous in the same sentence. But from the good work of Chainalysis and the reporting that you've done, we can clearly see that it is not either of those. It can be the opposite.
Yeah, I think like today, you look at how a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or many of its successors worked, and you see, oh, there's a list of every transaction in the blockchain. Who could ever imagine that this was anything but fully transparent? But if we go back to like 2011, when I wrote the first piece I wrote about Bitcoin, Bitcoin was worth $1 at the time and was a totally new and unproven thing. And it seemed like there was no way to connect someone's Bitcoin addresses to their identity. If it wasn't anonymous, at least it seemed pseudonymous. Like you could hide behind the pseudonym of your addresses, or like many pseudonyms, because you could spin up a new address for every transaction. And it was only through like very clever clustering techniques that were first invented, I would say first like shown definitively to be possible by this researcher at University of California, San Diego, Sarah Mickeljohn, and then used by Chainalysis too and built into its software. That kind of veil between someone's identity and their Bitcoin addresses started to crumble. And then once you can like build a cluster, you can sometimes trace their money through other tricks, some of which Sarah found, to an exchange, you send a subpoena to the exchange and you get their real identity. Or you can sometimes do undercover transactions with someone to get their addresses and identify them in that way or show what they're doing. So slowly those things added up over the years until I think it's probably just a better maxim to say that Bitcoin is fully traceable. In fact, any cryptocurrency that doesn't try to make itself untraceable is the opposite of untraceable. It's extremely transparent, and following the money is actually probably easier than with the traditional finance system. And that created this incredible scenario where a decade of cyber criminals thought that they were in the dark, and then suddenly the lights were just switched on and they were all exposed.
Yeah, what a misconception that would have been. The other part to Traces in the Dark, Andy, which probably comes with a bit of an R rating at this point, is the really tragic events of Welcome to Video. Super emotionally
Yeah.
tolling. You know, I took a moment, even just after reading the book, to come to terms with the extent of that sort of exploitation. What were the responses like from the people when you spoke about that, when you investigated through that? How was that
Yeah.
experience for you?
Right. So Welcome to Video, just to make it really clear, was after AlphaBay was taken offline, several of the investigators just went right on to this next case, which turned out to be the biggest child sexual abuse video network on the dark web by some measures, and used cryptocurrency to allow people to pay for these videos, essentially, which is actually pretty unusual within that world. And that had made Welcome to Video, had helped it to grow enormously, but then also turned out to be this kind of fatal flaw because IRS criminal investigators were able to follow all of that money, ultimately identify and arrest 337 people, men mostly, almost entirely, around the world who were uploaders and downloaders and actual hands-on abusers of children, not just the administrator of the site, who was also traced and arrested in Korea, but the entire network of hundreds of people complicit and enabling and actively doing these horrific things to children. And yeah, I did struggle to get the kind of human side of that story from the agents and prosecutors involved, but particularly the agents, not only because they're like tough guy federal agents who don't like to talk about their feelings, but also because it was traumatizing for them. These are IRS, these are like financial investigators who, for the first time in their careers, and this is a very strange case that they were treating a child exploitation case as a follow the money financial investigation. That's really unique. And so they never encountered these materials or that world before, nor have I, of course. I'm not even legally allowed to look at the materials that were part of this case. Not that I would ever want to, but so just getting them to talk about like the experience of that trauma. Tigran Gambarian and his partner on the case, Chris Jancheski, both of them at IRS, was a challenge. And just, I don't know, I suppose took hours of talking through it and asking the question different ways. And even so, I'm not sure that I think I was able to get them to admit at least that the case changed them, change their notion of like the darkest things that human beings are capable of. But I'm not sure that I truly even myself know what that means because I didn't see the things myself. And I describe this to the reader, but of course, I don't show them that either. And just a few details of what happens with Welcome to Video go a long way. And I did not want to graphically describe any of these materials. So it's just like a little peek, I suppose, like the barest glimpse, like behind this terrible curtain where the darkest things on the internet occur. It was even for me, two steps removed, I would say, from the materials. I found it it was a dark period of reporting that I spent on this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so tragic. The children going back to school in Australia just in the last couple of days has highlighted the phenomenal work locally that the e-safety commissioner is doing in partnership with the Australian Federal Police and even the child or anti-exploitation entities here, which I think is great. There's been certainly a rise in the awareness, online safety, plethora of resources available for parents, children, schools, leaders, and everything alike to actually combat this sort of stuff. But It's probably the most tragic thing you could ever imagine as it pertains to just humanity at the moment. Certainly something to be solved for. And yeah, thankfully the work in the alliances that we've been describing throughout some of the stories in the book, Andy, bring that to life. So
Yeah. And I do want to highlight though, that as this is definitely like a journey through hell, if the digital equivalent at least. But there's a happy ending if there can be one in that world. Like uh, the whole network was taken down. The administrator was arrested. He actually, because it was Korea and their laws are very strange, he was released within 2 years, bizarrely. But that's not the case for the hundreds of men around the world who were complicit in this. And in some ways, I would say that the administrator in a child sexual abuse materials network is not necessarily the worst offender, as bad as what they're doing is. It's the hands-on abusers of children. And they, many of them were arrested and are in prison as a result of that cryptocurrency tracing and as a result of the illusion of Bitcoin privacy. I mean, that was one result of that misconception. And 23 children were rescued as a result of this case as well. It's not fun to look at that world, but this is in some ways, sadly, one of the happier stories from that whole realm.
There's two things for that. I've met in my time with the military and working alongside some of the AFP. We're just thankful that there are people that do this work, and it would be some of the darkest work on the planet in my eyes. Been to war and seen some terrible things, but that to me is much more horrific. And I'm very thankful there are people out there that are doing that work on behalf of myself as a father and everyone else that shares the thought. So I thank those people. And if there are any listening from us, thank you. I want to turn it to more of a happier note, if we can. You wrote an article, Andy, in 2019 about a coin bandit, which I was really fascinated by. And it's only been the last sort of 3 or 4 days that the Bitcoin bandit has come back and is starting to move that 90 million worth of Bitcoin that was stolen 6 years ago. Interesting to see that he's moving now. He, she, whoever it might be, we don't know, it might be a gang, but I found that really fascinating that we've started recording today and 6 years ago, this Bitcoin bandit started stealing. It's been the last few days that it started to move. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, it's been a few years myself, but he's called the blockchain bandit, right? Because he's actually stealing Ethereum.
That's right.
Mostly,
Ethereum combing,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, Ether combing, yeah. Sorry, I'm brushing up on this like mentally as I think about it myself. But it's fascinating. I love these stories of, this is so common in a way. You see someone pull off a massive heist. And actually the blockchain bandit was doing something much less dramatic. He was kind of just figuring out, I think it was cracking brain wallets, essentially these memorizable passwords that are often insecure, and just like using that to find, actually he was, I think, checking like incredibly simple passwords, like 1, 2, 3, and just enumerating them, seeing if he could find someone who was dumb enough to have used those. And then through that, just brute forcing over time, amassing a lot of stolen money. But these thieves have this problem that it's like, they make a big score and then they're in their getaway car, but then all these blockchain tracers, all these cryptocurrency tracers like Chainalysis and their ilk can watch that car as it's like moving through the city streets from an eagle-eyed, perspective, and a bird's eye view rather. And you can see every turn that it takes. And it will be very difficult for this blockchain bandit, I think, to truly cash out without being identified at some point. Perhaps he or she or they are in Russia or in North Korea and will get away with this, or maybe they're not and they won't. And that'll be interesting too. But you see this again and again, that people steal an enormous amount of cryptocurrency and then they're afraid to cash it out or to do anything with it because they have come to learn that they can be traced, and they sit on it for years and sometimes watch it grow to enormous value, but can't do anything with it or are afraid to do anything with it. That's happened in like several cases where, and nonetheless, Tigran Gambarian at the IRS or somebody else traces the money, even if they haven't spent it, and knocks on their door. And that has resulted in IRS criminal investigations seizing the first, second, and third biggest seizures of money of any kind in U.S. criminal history just in the last few years. And
it's absolutely wild.
just as another interesting case, like in the midst of the FTX meltdown,
Mm.
somebody stole $500 million or so from FTX. We don't know yet whether that was an insider or an external hacker exploiting the chaos of that bankruptcy, but we may soon, because you can follow that money on blockchains too. And Chainalysis and all of its competitors and law enforcement are doing that. And I think it'll be very difficult for that thief as well, or embezzler or whoever they are, to get away with it. So, it does, I'm watching myself like just to see when that will be revealed, because I feel
Yes.
like it will be sooner or later.
Yeah, super interesting. And like you mentioned, Ben, really crazy timing, like recording this with Andy Greenberg on the 28th of Jan.
Mm.
And this has just come out in the news. I'm reading a report here from Chainalysis, actually, which does cite you, Andy, only just from January the 25th. So only 3 days ago. Like
Yeah.
6 years, blockchain Bandit's wallet was almost entirely dormant. And now it's for the first time moving their holdings $90 million at current prices to new addresses.
It was
Time will
something like
tell, hey? Yeah.
51,000 ether stolen over 10,000 wallets. I just find that phenomenal to start with, but
Yeah.
it's even more crazy. Do you think there's a future in, this is probably a loaded question and one more like this for you, Andy, but do you think there's a future in cryptocurrencies, noting what we know now?
Oh, do you mean in cryptocurrency crime or in cryptocurrency like
More
writ
broadly, because
large?
it's so traceable,
Yeah.
right? And we've since the inception of cryptocurrency, we've always thought it to be anonymous and therefore untraceable. Now that we've seen that it is, do you think, as a more broad concept for cryptocurrencies, do you see a future in it?
I think that the fact that crypto crime doesn't pay, that like it's very traceable. In some ways, like a lot of cryptocurrency people think that that's a good thing. Chainalysis is very pro cryptocurrency themselves, and Michael Groniger and Jonathan Levin, its two kind of most active co-founders, are super pro Bitcoin, pro cryptocurrency. They see themselves as like these sheriffs cleaning up the Wild West and civilizing this new phenomenon so that it can thrive, as they would put it. I do think that, I don't know, I'm kind of agnostic about like the legitimate uses of cryptocurrency. Like, is it a good investment? Will it ever be like very useful as a means of transaction or remittances or something? It's not I'm more interested in the dark stuff, the dark side of these things. And in that world, there's still an enormous amount of crypto crime happening. It's just mostly being done by people who don't care that they can be traced, because
Yeah.
they're in Russia, they're in North Korea. Russians are still using cryptocurrency to extort massive ransoms. North Koreans are still stealing it by the billions. And they are often traced in great detail, but that doesn't mean that they can be got, that anyone can lay hands on them or make them see the inside of a Western courtroom.
Andy, to wrap up the episode, we've got to ask, what's next for Andy Greenberg? Will you be reporting on anything new, do you think? Anything coming out on the horizon?
I've got some Wired stories. I'm thankful to have my day job at Wired. I don't know what story I have that's worthy of a book again anytime soon. I feel like this was one that I actually, in some ways, have been reporting for more than a decade. So I don't know, it might take me that long again to find a story this sprawling. Even this story, I had to just choose a point for it to end in some ways. And it nonetheless goes on. And I barely managed to like squeeze into the book those stories of the biggest record-breaking seizures of cryptocurrency in history. FTX, of course, is a whole other fantastically dramatic and dark and twisty story that will be unfolding. And I'm just going to, I don't know, I remain not terribly like interested in the legitimate cryptocurrency ups and downs, but I will be following all of these crime stories. That's my world, and I'll just keep covering it.
Absolutely. I think potentially as the rabbit hole ensues, Andy, we'll get you on another episode of Dark Mode to tell us all about it. So really appreciate your time on Dark Mode and look forward to speaking to you next time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Eddie.
Thanks to you both for having me. It was a lot of fun.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. See you on the next episode of Dark Mode.